Well, good evening again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Not Quite the Witching Hour. Me, your host, Thomas Sheridan, as we negotiate the culture wars that are impacting upon the lives of those of us who wish to experience them positively as they're unfolding at the moment. The why are they unfolding as this eon, epoch, yuga cycle moves over into the next cycle, eon, yuga, epoch, aeon, whatever you want to call it. I hope you're all keeping well, and thanks for giving me all the really great feedback on the show. I'm glad that you're all enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying it. I was thinking today about how, media is tremendously partisan compared to how it was even in the 90s or 80s. Yeah, you had newspapers and TV shows, and you had documentary, not documentary so much, current affairs programs that generally had some kind of bias or swing, whether it be to the left or to the right. It was just a given. But even that said, it wasn't completely that way. It wasn't so rabidly partisan as it's become in recent times, particularly on the left, where it's become incredibly partisan. Now, even in the past, you might in the 1970s had someone like William F. Buckley writing articles for the New York Times, and when he be considered like a right winger, but he wasn't really, not by what came later on, the neocons. But it was just indicative of that time. Yes, the New York Times had a reputation of being Upper West Side Manhattan, WASP or Jewish, left leaning, intellectual ivory tower. Now it has that more than ever now. I can remember even when I used to read the New York Times, as soon as the 90s came along, literally every single story became an editorial. It was probably the beginning of the work that led me to writing the book, The Anvil of the Psyche. I was starting to see you wouldn't just have news reports, you would have editorials. And there were editorial swings that were in favor of liberal or left wing commentaries. And one of the most repugnant ones I ever saw was actually an op-ed. It wasn't an article, and it was about a bunch of boys had sexually assaulted a woman under the boardwalk in Coney Island, and this woman obviously had been left in a terrible state by it. The New York Times writer then finishes with, "This is because the tragedy of this woman being scarred for life, having been having been sexually assaulted, is now compounded by the extra tragedy of these young men whose lives have been destroyed, having been charged and sent to prison for sexual assault." And that was when I remember really noticing what we have, like the kind of liberal whack jobs we have on The View, Rachel Maddow, the entire BBC, the entire Irish, German, French, everything, Northern European media, Canadian, whack job, ultra liberal, ultra left wing, woke that we have now that's actually dying. But these things don't develop in a vacuum, they don't happen overnight. And I was thinking today about where did all this actually come from? Yeah, we know that there was a liberal bias coming in to things like the New York Times, which was an extremely influential newspaper, but you wouldn't have seen it in things like the British newspapers. You wouldn't have seen it in newspapers like the Observer, or you wouldn't have seen it in the Times of London. Now, even the Guardian would not have had it to the same degree, being still back at that point, sort of anti-Thatcher, pro-miners, pro-labor unions type thing. I think I know when this all began to change, and it began in the most unlikely places. As the 1980s began, MTV Music Television started to move away from what its name suggests, a music television show network, and they increasingly started to put politics into it. They'd have these MTV news with this dry shites. One was called Kurt Loder, and the other was Tabitha Soren. Tabitha Soren was like the chicks on The View, smarty smart girl. She's so clever because she challenges the conservative politicians or whatever. And they would start off having things like, oh, Ozzy Osbourne signed the new record deal. Fleetwood Mac have announced a 50-day tour. Well, I'd expect like it to be, and then slowly migrating it to a fan club for the Clintons. And that was a huge element, a massive element of MTV. And they had this thing called Rock the Vote, which is supposed to get, young people should care about politics. Young people should care about this kind of thing. And it was nothing more than a free propaganda service for the Clintons. And that's where it began because MTV moved away from music, became more and more of a current affairs social engineering program network. The specific aim of getting the Clintons in the White House. Now, the Clintons were overtly shown as these cuddly people from Arkansas who were, they cared about gays and they cared about women's rights and they cared about abortion and all the usual lefty things. The Clintons have turned out since to be some of the most despicable human beings that ever lived. Remember, the Clintons are the only American administration to have attacked a European capital city, Belgrade, and doing this in order to whip up tense, sectarian problems in Kosovo with the intention of chasing out the Serbian Orthodox and having a complete Islamic control in Kosovo so they could build the biggest NATO base in Eastern Europe to attack Russia or to intimidate Russia. But the Clintons did all that. The Clintons bombed the capital city of a sovereign European country, and that should never be forgiven for that. And that should never be allowed to be forgotten either. How that happened. So you had that thing, and then they moved away from the political thing to a more of a social engineering thing. And you had these things called sex in the 90s. I'm sure that you remember them. Then they were just any excuse to talk about pink bits or sexual issues. And it's like, and you'd switch on MTV. Those of us who grew up in MTV in the 80s would switch on MTV in the 90s and go, where's MTV gone? It was the same, a lot of same. They replaced all the DJs, VJs. They replaced most of them with political spokespeople. And even really good shows like Headbangers Ball and 120 Minutes, they kind of vanished. And it was around the clock, 24-hour Edward Bernays, sexual politics. The Clintons are wonderful. The conservatives are going to take away your freedom, blah, blah, blah. And so you have a situation today where you have the likes of The View and Rachel Maddow and all the and others, not just in the United States, but also in Canada and in Europe, who think that that's what news and current affair and media is. They think that's what it is, that you must have a political bias. You must have an agenda. You don't read the news, you interpret the news from a liberalist point of view. And this, when the culture wars really started to take off, and I mean really, well, I remember the culture wars first starting to take off. I remember the Village Voice had an article by Michael Musto explain what political correctness is. I didn't. This is a long time ago now. This would be way back in the early 90s. I didn't know what political correctness was, and it was basically the beginnings of what we call woke. And so you didn't refer to black people anymore. You called them African Americans and this kind of thing. And you didn't call them homosexuals anymore. You called them gays. And there was this thing was like fodder for jokes by comedians back in a time when you had all these stand improv comedians in America. When improv was all the rage, which is when it was all rubbish, we'd have like a guy usually standing with a brick wall behind him with his sleeves rolled up, telling jokes that were not funny, and there'd be things based on that, like they say things like, "My dog is not a dog; it's a canine American." It's supposed, supposed to be the greatest joke ever. So a decline in comedy began at the same time too. A decline in that was a long way from Rodney Dangerfield. It was a long way from Rodney Dangerfield on Johnny Carson. A long way. There was the jokes were this awful observational comedy put across by people like Jay Leno, and then you have this these this MTV thing was that came in out in the 90s when MTV became a kind of a mind control operation that had filtered its way into new formats and new programming, women's daytime TV shows, talk shows, and they all came with the template of political activism or social commentary contained within the actual program. Now, while shows like, the late night shows we have today, Jimmy Kimmel or Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, they're allegedly the lineage of the Merv Griffins, the Tom Schneiders, the Johnny Carsons. They couldn't be more removed. You would never see the likes of Tom Snyder, Johnny Carson, or even Arsenio Hall when he took over the show. Do that, have political statements. I can actually remember one time the gay activist group Act Up or Queer Nation, one of them interrupted a live broadcast, and Arsenio Hall lost his temper, and in quite a powerful, caustic, and very persuasive way, he said, "How dare you come onto my show and turn in what's an entertainment show where people who are forgetting their troubles or at the end of the day can have some fun, listen to some music. How dare you? How dare?" And he was right. He was right. Arsenio Hall was right. And then he said, "You call the show homophobic? So we had Elton John on last night. What are you on about?" And it was almost like Arsenio Hall was trying to build a wall between what they were doing to migrate the Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin type of late night show from becoming what it is right now. He was almost like a buffer when you think back on it now. A lot of good bands on it too. Like I remember like seeing Susie and the Banshees and everything on the Arsenio Hall show. And the you might have had a political, Johnny Carson might have come along in his opening monologue, and he might say, "Well, you see those guys in Congress? Yeah, they want to put a tax on bathrooms." Now, he wouldn't do it a left wing or a right wing thing. It'd just be, a so funny joke to make light of politics in the news. And then you'd have really good comics that come in later on, and like Rodney Dangerfield and others later, people like Sam Kinison, and it would come on and do really, really funny, genuinely funny comic segments on the show. Now the presenters of all these late night shows are a combination of, well, they think they see themselves as some kind of statesman, as some kind of statesman that are like pontificating the angst of the nation with quips and digs that are supposed to be funny or erudite, and they're stupid. It's obnoxious and pathetic, and you see it with tears in their eyes now because of like Trump being in power. This came, I think, from the MTV, the whole transformation from MTV from a music station to a current affairs station. Now, you see, like, uh, what's really depressing and quite shocking is when you see someone who was once part of, say, the old order of media and then very badly metamorphosizing into an awful version within the new order of media. And I'm talking about someone like Howard Stern. I can remember when Howard Stern was on, after he'd been fired from WNBC in New York, and he went on to K Rock, which is one of the best things to happen to radio in New York. You had a rock and roll show, a rock music station, and a pretty good one too. You know, there wasn't all hippie dinosaurs playing shite like, well, not shite, I know you love, but just playing Led Zeppelin's, the Maker over and over again, or Black Knight by Deep Purple. I'm just saying that you wouldn't, or Sweet Home Alabama. You would hear like all kinds of rock songs. You'd hear the Pretenders and like stuff that I really liked, like really good pop bands like the Pretenders. And so to have that play that music, but you'd have Howard Stern start at like 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 in the morning, whatever it was. And I can remember going to work on the subway and there'd be jokes being taught. Something would happen on the Howard Stern show, like he'd be having a row with his mother, or he'd be giving Gary Delabate a really hard time, and it was so unbelievably funny that you'd have your Walkman on in the New York subway, and you'd be like this, and you'd look around, and half of the people in the same train carriage would be like this, because they're listening to the same show. It's unbelievably funny stuff, like uh, we talk about like when he was beaten up by blacks in Roosevelt, wherever it was in Long Island where he grew up, and and he had one black friend, and someone challenged him, prove he had a black friend, and he brought in this one kid that was like, it was really was his black friend, and he used to come over to the house, and then Howard Stern's mother called up the show and go, whatever the black kid's name, would just say, Brian. He goes, Brian was a sweet boy. He was a sweet colored boy. And he goes, and Harris there, goes, you can't say colored, he starts racist. And she goes, he was your real friend, and blah 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 blah. And then Howard Stern would put on this act where he'd be saying, yeah, mother, you didn't know the real me. Yeah, you thought I was playing chess or board games with Brian in the day. At night, I was sticking a heroin needle into the last vein of my penis, and she'd be screaming, "Howard, don't you dare talk like that!" It was just so fucking funny. It would be just spectacularly funny. You know that kind of thing. Or when a celebrity would die, he would take the piss out of them, and it was like, it was just, and it was all so much was impromptu, and it was so funny. And they had Kurt Waldheim Jr., which would be a man Fred doing a Nazi, and they would be like having quizzes like what's the best rifle to use to kill Jews, and it'd be like it was you couldn't imagine stuff like that, and they'd have like they'd have a guy a redneck on. He goes Kurt Waldheim, and he'd have like Howard Stern saying, he says, do you hate Jews? And they go, do I hate Jews? I hate Jews. And he goes, what kind of rifle would you use to shoot him? And he'd say something like, a 2-2. And your man doing Kurt Waldheim Jr. would come on screaming and say, a 2-2 to take down the Jordan? You need at least an M60. And I'd be like, everybody, Jewish people, everybody was screaming, laughing at this. And he goes, Kurt Waldheim's stand-up comedy. And he goes, three Jews walk into a bar. They killed them. Like I have to check that the algorithms now on this program on this video, so I don't get banned. But that's what was on mainstream radio in the 90s on K Rock. And I mean, I can remember ones where they had made a puppet of the producer, an Italian American guy called Gary Delabate. Howard Stern used to give him an awful time because he had really big overbite, like Freddie Mercury. And the puppet was kidnapped, and they had the ransom. It was a joke, and they made it sound like Gary Delabate had was responsible, like his negligence had made kidnappers kidnap a puppet of him, and they were all sent. They were all pretending it was. He thought it was real, but the rest of them all made the story up and talked. The gang calling in saying they had a ransom for the puppet. I mean, to hear this every day on the radio, and then you'd have like people on, like celebrities and people in bands on, and he taking the piss out of something funny, and they'd be loving it. I can remember like he had Duran on once, and it was like it got really, really dirty. Like the things he was like really literally X-rated stuff, and he was always skirting around the the FCC. He was always getting fines for obscenity and stuff like that. And then you listen to that, and you can go onto YouTube and listen to the old programs of that, and sometimes there was riveting radio. Where one time a real serial killer called him up. That's actually on YouTube. Check it up. And he goes, it was a guy on the phone. He claims he's a serial killer, and the guy really was. And he was talking about killing prostitutes and stuff like that. And so, Howard Stern, and then went from that to him going after the people who were unjabbed. Uh, really, he's saying you deserve to die and everything like this and all this stuff. I know lots did it, but it was like, and then him going, then you had Trump derangement syndrome in the extreme, and his career is like in the gutter now. Although he must be in his 70s at this point. But, to see that fall apart, where he was part of the old order, I said, that was actually where talent and being funny mattered. And now he just basically, he's ragging on Trump all day when the people have bother listen to him. And he's, the king of all media is no longer the king of all media. It's really Joe Rogan has that now. And that tipping point has become very caustic and very incendiary. You have a situation now where Whoopi Goldberg is making false accusations against a bakery on Staten Island because she's on The View. And then you have to do legal fact checkers live on that show, The View, while these poisonous women are basically throwing out slanders and slurs at anyone they can. During the show, this is a long way from when it used to be much more fun and open and respectable in a way. It was kind of more respectful. And this happened because of a genuine, a few things. The original ivory tower mentality of the New York Times, when it started to become really what we'd call pre-woke, pre-politically correct, and a desire by TV hosts to be part of that world. I can remember, like, you'd have like Howard Stern didn't live in Manhattan. He continued to live on Long Island. But you would see more and more of the TV hosts that would be appearing on NBC, ABC, newsreaders, and that kind of thing, all starting to live on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the ivory tower heartland of the New York Times. They sought to become part of that world. Your man with the beady eyes from MNS, whatever it's NBC, that's their NBC spin-off, MSNBC. The guy Joe in the morning, what his name is, the beady eyes, who had to go see Trump. I remember during the lockdown, he was ragging on people who were not needle crafted, really going to town on them. And it was from his balcony, and his balcony was overlooking Central Park. So there you go. He was in those multi-million dollar beautiful apartments along the upper east and west side of Central Park. Looking down from their ivory tower on the peasants. And this bubble did, and this has happened in other countries, and it's happened in your country, my country, in different ways. But because the United States is on the forefront of the kind of cultural zeitgeist, and probably always will be, well, at least for if going forward will be, that mentality disseminated into other countries and other cultures. Now we're in a very different time, and Rachel Maddow gets $30 million a year, and she does something like 1 hour a week on the air. It's quite shocking. The salaries are spectacular. And so it's like X and Twitter. He first molded buying X and Twitter as a joke, and then he ended up buying it, and now all the pedos are all gone to Blue Sky. I could see this maybe be a joke, but this apparently NBC, who's the main broadcaster, is decoupling itself from MSNBC and not financing it anymore. So basically, it's a worthless company with all these cretins on it who are the worst kind of ivory tower snobs who said the most awful things about Trump voters. And here, all of a sudden now, the hunter has become the hunted. Don't ever let yourself believe that things can change. They cannot change. Things can change very, very fast. And it's if you have no like well, okay, I definitely have an emotional attachment to Trump winning the election. I feel like the world's a much better place. I feel like there's, like I said, there's potentials and possibilities. Now, truthers are saying things like, "Oh, Trump brought through Operation Warp Speed and the jabs." Yeah, but he's distinctly and clearly stated from day one, it should always be voluntary. Problem solved. That's all you want, isn't it? Here is the needlecraft. If you don't feel like taking it, it's okay. What more do you want from this life? And this is like the troopers can't get past that. And they also recently, tr El- Elon Musk, through a discussion, had mentioned something about we're trying to change things to a new order. Now he didn't say new world order; he said new order, and he was talking about like the swamp in Washington D.C. Will try and change to a new order of doing things. People do that, use that language, that terminology all the time. And now the truthers are going nuts saying he said New World Order. He didn't say New World Order. It wasn't like George Bush Sr.'s infamous speech, where we'll bring in a New World Order, not to rule the jungle. It's not. It was nothing like that. It was a casual statement during a discourse, and it was a factual statement where things are changing. Trump is filling his cabinet with non-political people. He's filling his cabinet with non-politicians, bureaucrats, career politicians. So a new order is coming in. But a lot, so it's like like people can read anything any way they want, and that's their own prerogative. But I think that I personally, and most people I know, and I think judging by the comments on this broadcast, all of you feel kind of the same way too. That there's a sense of a new wind has blown through, that the sails can be hoisted up, and possibilities of new trajectories are there, new courses are there. That's how I feel. I feel very much that way. And there was it felt like being a clock spring was wound up really tight before the US election. And when it came out that Trump had won all the swing states and he was going to be president, I know people who were liberals who were actually like, okay, well, thank God it's over, it's done. This is why there were so few protests towards the end. What, and they got and it didn't matter if the media got increasingly more vicious, calling the event at Madison Square Gardens a Nazi rally. And then the protesters were literally, apparently there wasn't even 100 of them. It reminded me of the protesters at the big, you know, immigration control event in Dublin, where you had like the establishment couldn't whip together more than 80 people. There was more coppers than them to sit there going, refugees are welcome, with the despondent look on their face. And so it's going to change very quickly now, even though Britain and Ireland and Canada and other countries are deep in the bowels of woke and this neoliberalist worldview from the WEF and so on. The world is changing. This what you'll see a lot of differences now when Trump comes into office and starts, yeah, making things happen. And like I said, it wouldn't matter if they assassinate him. It wouldn't matter. because the die is cast now. The new order is here, and ooh, they'll be saying I said new order too. The new order is here, and people, even people who would have been traditionally on the left, I think many of them subconsciously want to change. They're sick of woke. It kind of like, although I'm not a fan of the Burke family and but what was done to Enoch Burke, putting him in prison, was a disgrace. No way he should be in prison, that man. But it's ironic that he's still in prison while woke is dying and people are removing their pronouns from their CVs. The irony of the pronoun on the CV being removed, being dropped en masse, but the prison cell lock on Enoch Burke's cell, it's as tight as ever. It's as locked, firm, shut as ever. So we're in this kind of dichotomy. We're in this kind of state of flux. It hasn't quite come here yet, but I've been doing something. I made sure to have my anti-seasick tab, my anti-motion sickness tablets, and a good paper bag beside me. I watched some of the political broadcast and bits and pieces on the news about the Irish general election, and it's remarkable the lack of energy and vitality among the political establishment here. The the smugness and the smirks are gone. The cockiness is gone. They know they were they. I'm pretty sure that election in Ireland was called in the belief that they thought Kamala Harris would win. That's why they called that election, and they said now we can get the woke uh, pseudo republic we want, the woke utopia they longed for, and they got the biggest fright of all when Trump won. And you can see it; they don't look right. The main party's slogan is a new energy. Well, you can see there's no energy. You see that I see in those politicians, those establishment politicians' faces, the same look that I saw in the anti-fascist, anti-far right bunch that I saw standing outside the GPO in Dublin that day. Br- bravado, bravado, but not genuine vitality. And that's to me is the Trump effect, the Trump dividend already working its way across the world. They got the fright of their lives. They thought that Kamala Harris would come in and them and their children would be safe in government because there was no Trump tariffs going to be pushed on American companies that are in Ireland. Well, now that's a real thing. And Ireland could be a very different country in 4 or 5 years. And the entire sort of propagandized upper middle class who run this country may find themselves in a very hostile environment, a very hostile environment. And so you look, I reckon the turnout for the upcoming Irish election will be tiny. It'll be small. I wouldn't be surprised. Although they do lie about things and say, "Oh, it was a big turnout." There wasn't. I think there's this spark has gone out of them because they gambled and they crapped out. They thought Kamala Harris would be coming here to tell them how wonderful they were while she was cackling. And now it's probably going to be Trump coming here and telling them what pieces of shit they are. And they know they are pieces of shit. And you will see that echoed in every country around the world. You will see that in every country around the world. And Neil Oliver had a story the other day that a Dutch politician had discovered that NATO was behind the COVID and pandemic, and it doesn't make perfect sense now. Remember the the what you call it, the what was her name, the the hospitals, the temporary hospitals in England, the Nightingales hospitals, the Florence Nightingale hospitals, they were all set up by as army stations. I remember the first thing that happened in Ireland was they parked a warship at the docks in Dublin and started building army field hospitals in front of a battleship. Why would you want a navy ship to fight? What, shoot at the viruses? It was to make you know that NATO or and Ireland, I think, is secretly in NATO. I think the politicians have secretly put Ireland in NATO without telling them. And the Irish people discover that we're in NATO, not when the politicians say we're in NATO, but when the hypersonic missiles start landing on Irish cities. And yeah, it makes perfect sense now, doesn't it? There's a whole night thing. There's a NATO operation. So basically, NATO attacked the world, and it's a beautiful thing that Trump hates NATO and dislikes it and wants to abolish it. Basically, why does it even exist? Its job was to protect us from communism. Communism was gone. Uh, it became a government by itself. It became a nation by itself, and it became a very powerful machine for the sale and weapons and this kind of thing. Things are changing fast, and I can even looking back on the 80s or the 90s, sorry, with the MTV change, I remember that happening very fast. I don't remember a long transition from when MTV was a music channel playing the Police and had Benatar and all their other staples, and then suddenly it was all Sex in the 90s and Rock the Vote. It happened very quickly. It happened very, very quickly and took over like a virus very quickly. And what's happening now in America is happening very, very quickly. It's 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 remarkable to watch unfold, but it ties in perfectly with the concept of the wave function collapse at the end of a cycle because you're coming down the wave, right? So it's like a skier coming down a slope. You're coming faster, 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 faster to the bump, and then you start flying up again. It's almost like a momentum thing, and then it's a slow thing to the top. It's not a switch that switches on and suddenly this happens. Nothing like that happens in nature. It's remember the peak and the troughs of the sine waves are quite short and narrow. The cycles, that's where the word cycles come from, how far it's stretched out. The cycles are tight. So you do notice the change, not instantaneously, but you notice the momentum and the trajectory. And you can be assured that this momentum and trajectory that we're suddenly seeing within US political social dynamics will affect every aspect of our lives going forward. Our families, our relationships, our sense of self, what we want as individuals from our own lives, what we seek to achieve, to create. And I can tell you something. The moment Donald Trump stood on that stage and was, announced that he was president of the United States, there was no going back. And who wants to go back to that? I think many of the people who are even involved in political correctness and wokeness are sick of it and don't want to go back to it. And that's why they suddenly throw off the pronouns. Yeah, I think a lot of them were like the Khmer Rouge, they were hiding, or the SS were hiding their insignia. I think a lot of them too were like, oh, I can't be. I mean, I can't deal with this anymore. No, I just want to get out of my life. You see, the thing is that I think one of the reasons my show I've stayed on the air so long is that I don't do doom. I will say to people, yeah, things are crap. Things are not good. But come on, this, we'll get out of this. Just wait. Just hold the line. What we have, we hold. We'll get there. And in the meantime, and rather than negatively getting sucked into what the problems are, do something to distract yourself from it. It's not burying your head in the sand. Like if there's a problem that's bigger than you as an individual can solve, focusing your energy on it is not going to undo it. It's only going to energetically couple you with that issue. And you see that all right now with all the Trump. That's what Trump arrangements is, Trump, is they can't uncouple. So what you do is say, look, we have a situation in the world. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to record a piece of music. I'm going to plant a garden. I'm going to build that extension on the house. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. It's not the same thing as when you have a problem in your neighborhood or in your job where you can do something about it. When something you can't, this is a great way to trap lefties trap people in activism. You can't escape activism. So you can't do nothing about it. You're creating awareness, this bullshit. So you just say, look, okay, it's things. It, just say the worst happened and World War III took off, right? Well, nothing you can do constantly focusing on it, the negatives of it, like when am I going? When are we going to be hit by Russian bombs? We'll change that. We'll change that. Watching the news every night in terror won't change that. It's not the same thing as burying your head in the sand. It's saying to yourself, I've got a cousin who lives in the countryside. Would it be safer living there? Is there anything I can do to my home to store up food in a blast-proof shelter in the bottom of the ground? I'm just saying it's the worst case scenario. I'm not saying it's going to happen. Isn't that better? That's not burying your head in the sand. That's quite the opposite. That's taking measures to protect yourself and your loved ones. That's why you have to uncouple from massive world issues. You know, show me anyone who was involved in activism that achieved anything. The only one I can think of is apartheid in South Africa. That's the only one that seems to have worked. And, because apartheid was so morally reprehensible. Yeah, I know about the ANC and all the Winnie Mandela and all the baggage there. But at the end of the day, apartheid as a concept, it was just wrong. It's just wrong. And that one fell apart because it was genuinely wrong. I guess it was in violation of natural law. But how many years has CND been or anti-war activists been going on about that and stop wars? Never, never. Who was the one who finally stopped wars? Trump. Is Trump the first person you think of when you see some hippie strumming an acoustic guitar saying "We shall overcome" or "Amazing Grace" or "Imagine" by John Lennon? No, but he ended wars. Why? Because it was a new way of doing things. And activism is full of this. So you can't, the this the thing in the old esoteric law that to give a thing a name is to bring it to life. To name it like is to bring it to life. Like, so for instance, if you're dealing with, say you're in demonology, you're dealing with a demon, you don't actually use its name. You'll use the sigil to represent it. And the sigil to represent it during the ritual to prevent you from naming it and also trapping it within the magic circle that's encircles the sigil or around yourself. So you're aware of what you're dealing with. You're involved indirectly with it, but because you have not named it and because you have not let it play with you and mess with you, because if it gets into you, boom, it's in. See, this is why I think a lot of this sort of like activism, a lot of it I think is an egregore being a kind of a demonic force that creates itself. Communism, Marxism is like that. Khmer Rouge, woke is like that. It's a demonic force that creates out of all the negative energy poured into it. It brings it to life as almost like a living being of its own. So we have like the treatment of the kulaks in Russia by the Bolsheviks was an egregore. People and farmers in the countryside who own their own land and lambs are enemies of the revolution of the Bolsheviks of the October Revolution. So we must destroy them. It's exactly what Starmer is doing in England with the English farmers and the inheritance tax. That's his kulaks. Kulaks. They become egregores. And the whole thing of the calling people far right was an egregore. And the egregore can never, the only way you get rid of the egregore is to not play with it anymore. So if you continue to invoke the egregoric energy, you have what there happens currently, what's happening in America right now, that they're calling black people or Hispanics who voted for Trump, that they're calling them internalized white, far right white nationalists, or the black women or Latino women who voted for Trump, they're calling them internalized misogynists. They're defeating the egregore gets cannot. It's totally insatiable. Well, how would you stop all that? You say, I don't. I'm not going to involve anymore. I'm not involved anymore. I'm not involved. And then the egregore is dissipated. So that's why I always, activism seems very appealing to lots of people. But ask yourself, well, what could I do with that energy that would be more useful to me in improving my life on the ground in a, you know, microcosm? That if enough of us did it, this is why I push the idea of the tribes. What we do as individuals on the microcosm will affect the macrocosm. It'll affect it, and so it's important. If you do individual little things to break away from the systemic egregore of, say, woke or what's running your country, even small things, you'd be surprised, even small little things, you'd be surprised how quickly it falls apart because these things are dependent upon the energetic. It's like quantum entanglement. They're totally dependent upon them. And this is, so, and people who are like us, we, going getting involved in elections and stuff is very, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. That's unless you're someone like Trump or Elon Musk who's vast amounts of money. And then you have like the FU cushion, to deal with that. You have this, you have to be very careful. Uh, Now, one of the things that makes Americans different than Europeans is Americans say, yeah, I deserve this. I want the best. I deserve the best. Show me how I can get it. And then the person beside them saying, good for you. Let's go ahead and do it. I'm right behind you. And that was all being taken away from Americans by woke, by critical race theory, by gender stuff, by just shitty, evil things like FEMA not helping people that had in the floods that had Trump signs on their doors. It's really shitty. This is the thing. Activism is evil. Ultimately, it destroys you. And like I've known people that were activists, and all it did was eat them alive. All it did was eat them alive. That's them commit suicide and stuff like that because they get to the point where they're not achieving anything. They've wasted their life on something, and there's no way out of it. They can't break from it. They're in this toxic relationship. They just can't break from. They just can't decouple from. Where if they had have like said, okay, I'm not happy. Like I give like that's why one of the reasons I think the South African stuff worked was the food boycotts. People stopped buying the oranges. Was it Outspan was the oranges that came out of South Africa? And they just stopped buying South African foods. And they didn't go on holiday there. And they didn't play Sun City or go to Sun City. And it did work. It absolutely worked. Because what was going on in South Africa was against natural law. And so it was doable. But like, if you say you're like an Irish woke person or a British woke person, and you have a problem with Trump, and you say, "Well, I'm never going on holiday in America while he's the president," and I'm like, "What?" You know? So you have the money to go to beautiful Southern California in winter, or Florida in winter, or upstate Maine, or upstate New York, all these beautiful places, but you're not going to, for instance, the Grand Canyon, the Florida Keys. the woodlands of New England and the mountains of the Rockies, they're somehow damaged by a political candidate that you don't like. You're not going to go. You go. See, this is madness. This is madness. You know. Also, this is madness. You're robbing yourself. It's like you're cutting out off your nose to spite someone else. It's mad. It's pure and complete madness. And so the best thing is like, you have Trump derangement syndrome. What's the best way to deal with it? Just don't think about it. Just forget about it. There's things in this country that get on my nerves. I know they're flooding the country with immigrants, and I know that they're flooding them in because they want the political parties here want a Tammany Hall situation where they can get a new generation of foreigners who they'll pamper now, so they'll vote for them later. And it's pure evil. But there's nothing I can personally do about it. I can try to motivate people on a show like this, but I know there's nothing I can personally do about it. But what I can do about it is when I see things that are glimmers of hope, such as Ireland's economy being wiped out by Trump's tariffs, I'll say, just wait. We'll see how many immigrants we have when there's no benefits for them. We'll see how smug the Irish professional classes are, the credential classes, in their own ivory towers, when the working class are coming for them. Is that what happened? But even just the fear of it might even be enough. And that's why I see fear. I see fear in the eyes of the politicians here. Do you remember when Trump went to the UN and he quite rightly castigated the Germans for basically decoupling from their fossil fuels policy and hooked themselves up to a Russian pipeline? And all the Russian delegations were all laughing, sniggering, and smirking at Trump when he said that. And where are they now? Where are they now? Where's the smirking now? Germany is in deep, deep trouble. Why? Because of their energy policies. Because of the credential class. It's ironic that the credential class will, say, well, you're not qualified to do this. You're not qualified to say this. But yet they make an excuse for Greta Thunberg. They make an excuse for her. That's fascinating. And she's part of she's part of a brainwashing dynamic that involves little girls that have been used for totalitarian regimes. Going Mao's China, Russia, Soviet Russia, Hitler's Germany, Third Reich, National Socialism. They they used an image of a little girl. Why? Because it represents innocence and purity. There's a constant out of the mouth of babes comes the truth. But they will feed the likes of Greta Thunberg stuff what to say. And it's the revolution. It's what they want. It's what they want you to say. And so you say, well, how that little girl is saying we should, you know, nationalize the state farms. How could you disagree with that? She's a sweet little girl. These people know, so this is real black magic, folks, what these guys do. This is real black magic. And the whole thing of like, another thing, whenever I'm dealing with a lefty, I want him off my ass or her off my ass. And I know, and I also want some kind of weapon. I'll just remind them, well, Hitler was socialist, and they will, and it's because it's true, Hitler, National Socialism, and they will go ballistic, and then they won't bother ever again. They'll start banging the table. Hitler was not a socialist; he was a fascist. Well, then why was it called National Socialist? And remember, this is how you do it. Right? Hey, what are you on about? Hitler was a fascist. He was a Nazi. He wasn't a socialist. That wasn't socialism. Then why was it called National Socialism? It wasn't so, but it actually says in the term National Socialism, the National Socialist Workers' Party. That's not true at all. So you're telling me that the term National Socialist Workers' Party never existed? It did, but it's not the same thing. And you will actually blow their brains up. But the important thing is they won't ever body ever again. And you have peace. So this energy that has been harvested by this lefty around you is calling everybody and anyone a Nazi, and probably you as well. But just remind them that the word national Nazi means National Socialism is enough to get that asshole off your arse. And so then you now have this that you're no longer part of this egregore that he's trying to feed. You're no longer food, and they're gone, and you got peace and quiet. It's like I have to laugh now. All all these women saying things like, we're not going to have anything to do with men the next 4 years." Jesus, great. Finally the men will get some peace. Sanguine Gnosis, love yous all. Take care, and I will see you next time on White the Witching Hour.